There was a big oil spill off the coast of Santa Barbara. A pipe connected to a drilling platform broke, and before it was plugged, more oil spilled into United States waters than in any known emission before. White water turned black, rushing onto pristine beaches, and wildlife in the thousands were smothered or suffered prolonged deaths coated in thick crude oil. We had been to those beaches. People who loved the ocean and the beaches and sea life were saddened and outraged. But the catastrophic results of human progress were not news to people who had been paying attention. We had already seen the factories vomiting chemicals into waterways, the oily fish and birds. For decades, the earth had been showing damage. We already knew that in the order of priorities for corporate and political leaders, money was placed over life. Who didn't? Sandy. For most of my life, I've been sensitive to nature. I think I would have died if I couldn't ride my bike near trees or swim in the ocean. I loved riding the waves and lying on the sand under the blue sky. Sewage in the ocean, however, was spoken of, and we saw the outlet pipes. But my starkest memory was as a much younger child swimming in the San Diego Bay while the adults chatted on shore, blind or unconcerned about the clumps of raw sewage that were floating around in the water. In my young mind, I knew the water was not right. Later, measures were taken to clean the bay, but the problem just went elsewhere. As the sky lost its blue, my breathing problems got worse, and I felt nervous and agitated in dirty air, particularly on drives to Los Angeles to visit relatives. They were wealthy and lived near the beaches and in wooded upscale neighborhoods away from the smog. But I remember the air getting worse the closer we got to LA, and more land was being covered by buildings, even along the coast where you couldn't see the ocean anymore. Once, in early morning, I saw some owls trying to land in trees that had just been cut down, and felt a seeping grief at the image of millions of birds without trees to live in and raise their babies. I was angry when vacant lawns and canyons were paved over. Don't people see that the kids need places to play in nature? There was going to be a revolution. Belief in this eventuality was written and talked about by some faction of almost every youth culture and minority population in the Western world. It was transmitted daily in popular music. The song What About Me, popularized by Quicksilver Messenger Service, described many of us. The world was on the eve of destruction, a ball of confusion. It was helter-skelter. The Beatles were saying it in double entendre. I didn't think they meant a political revolt, and one song made it clear that they were not advocating communism. I thought they were revolving in a spiritual way, aware of human greed and its assaults to the earth, and thereby to the self-esteem and mortal lives of all humanity. But I may have been seeking my own projections. The music our guys were putting together spoke of alternatives to the chaos that would result if people chose to revolt rather than revolve. The need for change and the numbers of people calling for it, both underground and in world societies, led us to prepare for either scenario. For many people we met and heard of, the revolution didn't come soon enough. Leftist policies aside, people feeling suppressed by laws that did not represent them were pumped by the prospect of revolutionary change, even if it had to be violent. Use of a natural plant had made outlaws of millions. Hippies and some of the college set tooted anarchy in terms of a big celebration, freedom and perpetual fun at last. But the anarchy that Charlie envisioned was sad and compellingly more realistic. Anarchy, he said, would go from merriment to mayhem, rape, and the worst you can imagine. Without police, and in our culture without Christ, he said, there is no sin that would not be committed. If fires were set and everyone was doing anything they wanted to do, people, and especially kids, who were otherwise unprotected, would need a way out. He saw the desert as a natural refuge, and bikers as potential defenders who could ferry them to safety. Much contributed to our conspicuity in the suburbs. Our singing at night may have seeped outside the house. The sounds of bike engines drew attention to the vested individuals hanging around the garage. Clearly, we were the biggest family on the block. Parents came looking for their pets and teenagers. The Bank of America owned the house. When Bill suddenly learned that bank representatives were coming to view the property, he advised that we leave quickly. Sandy and I recall spending at least a day at the home of one or more members of Iron Butterfly, a rock band. Rock and blues bands were living throughout Topanga Canyon in the valley. Cappy had a boyfriend who was a promoter for Buffalo Springfield. She'd hung out with Neil Young, who, incidentally, had taught Sandy guitar chords when he came to visit Dennis Wilson. After the bank people had gone, we went back to Gresham Street and Tribulations. Ruth broke up a street fight between Bobby's dog and one belonging to a neighbor, receiving painful puncture bites to her stomach for it. Sadie, on one of her independent outings, contracted the contagious skin disease impetigo, returning home to infect a few others. Epsom salt baths and extra sanitizing were necessary to heal the affected and keep this from spreading. Some people were angry at Sadie, and she was defensive. She came into the house after another of her trips and angrily told us she was leaving and taking Ziza with her. This time, I thought she would really go. Several people were in a car waiting for her. As she moved around the house, gathering her things, the White Album was playing on the record player. No matter what the Beatles were singing about, the song Sexy Sadie loosely fit her, and, on hearing it, she started to cry. Charlie shrugged in sympathetic resignation. "You can walk anywhere in the world," he told her. But without your soul, you're an empty shell." She wiped her face and went to tell the people she came with that she was not leaving. We were already fragmented. A handful of us remained in the desert, and for some reason we couldn't go to them as planned. A letter from Mary, written from jail 2 years later, described their isolation. "I'm thinking of the desert, the winter when 5 of us were at Barker's. Beautiful. Raining and snowing, taking showers and washing our hair by the wash tubs, and looking at the snow on the hills all around. Start out by drinking steaming cups of hot coffee round the kitchen table, thinking of how the water is going to feel, then going out, stripping quick, having the hose turned on your body, then your hair. And once the first coldness is over, it's all so alive. Wet and naked in snow and mountain air, hosing each other. Wow, I could dance now remembering it. God, we were so free and laughing. Clean and still wet, skittering barefoot over the stones to the house. Fresh clothes, a fire in the stove, and maybe some hot chocolate, or else some tea with honey. Dishes, laundry, house cleaning, bread baking started, and we'd gather firewood. Short mountain winter days, earlier lamps and dinner. Talk, music, music and words we didn't know were in us until they had a chance in the evening to come out. Special sounds for the pack rat in the attic, and for Casper, the baby skunk, watching for him to enter through his hole behind the food stash, sedately cross the kitchen floor, giving his attentive audience a polite nod, and go into his rolled oat stash in the left drawer of the otherwise unused butane stove. Long dark nights in warm beds and warm arms, breathing together. Man, we are so rich. Mary, circa 1972. Letter from Sybil Brand Institute for Women, LA County. From the Valley suburb, we talked to the Mad George on the phone. He missed us, and vice versa. We invited him for lunch and led him around the property. A day or two later, he called to say we could all come back to the ranch. Even the goddamned guys. Pearl accepted our return in stride. Randy pretended to pay us no mind. Larry and Benny were glad to see us. And the dogs were all a wag. Tom, Wolf, and a white and buff fluffy mutt we called Mutsy. Mutsy was the only pup from the litter at the farmhouse to escape the dog catcher during the Pearl and Randy roundup. Now grown, he had the run of the place with the others. After being cooped up in the suburbs, that's what we needed. Space and reasons to stoop, reach, lift, climb, and run. We had privacy in the little house. At the end of the road, we had sunrises and sunsets, fires at night, and we were high enough above city lights to ponder the galaxy. These fortunes served us with age-old and future insights, but practically we were just turning old shacks into havens, wood nooks into forts, making meals, making music, and making love. The ranch still had restrictions, but we could fit between the routines of George, Pearl, and the cowboys, who in their own ways were misfits on the edges of society. A bunch of us were in the house talking to George, while Pearl prepared to feed the dogs before she went home for the night. Hurrying across the linoleum with a dish of dog water, she spilled some, slipped, caught her fall, and slid a ways on one knee without spilling another drop. To our cheering applause, Pearl displayed a blushing smile, and George said, "Pearl, would you do that one again? I didn't see it." Mary, Juan, and others in the desert were picked up and came back to the ranch. Juanita and Brooks had agreed to stay behind to more and less man the fort. We wanted to revisit the desert, and if violence came to the cities like so many people said it would, we wanted to be out of its way. We began collecting necessities were we no longer able to make runs into towns and stores. At the same time, we were living as if our ranch life would never end. The toilet at the back house got fixed, but the guys usually stepped out to the edge of the woods at night. Sometimes I'd see 2 or 3 of them out there quietly talking, chuckling, aiming at trees, and competing for distance. Not all of us could ride George's horses. The ranch, after all, wasn't a playground for freeloaders. Discretion and timing were involved in knowing when and who to ask to saddle a horse. If Pearl and Randy were in a bad mood, they'd bitch about it. But Juan would do it. He was Pearl's best hand. He had the diplomacy to appease her, and the cojones to saddle a horse for whoever he damn well chose. Many of my days didn't go past George's house. People who didn't know said later that I was imprisoned there by Charlie, but I was my own warden. I sensed and took on responsibilities that suited me and held my attention. Sandy. Lynn was vigilant to the comings and goings through George's house. George sat in his chair with his cane beside him and inquired, "Who's there?" Or, in his hillbilly language, "Who bees it?" And we girls would announce ourselves using the names that he gave us. Brenda might come in as soft as a breeze and answer, "It bees Brenda," greatly accenting and rolling the R's. Ruth would offer an enthusiastic, "Howdy, George, it bees Wish." And Cappy, "Top of the morning to you, George, it bees Capistrano." When the guys other than the ranch hands came in, he became serious and suspicious, asking about chores. Juan might stride in, and with loud, clear confidence declare what had been done or needed doing. Ruby Pearl, with her flaming red hair and flushed face, seemed driven in her work, always on the move, but her body language emanated her moods and intentions. Lynn could pick up each person's demeanor and the overall atmosphere, and she would let everyone at the back of the ranch know if there's anything they needed to do to keep balance with the front. Regarding the ranch, Lynn was about balance. With George's approval, the whole ranch opened up to us. The movie set was my childhood fantasy. We could create sets, deconstruct them, and create new ones. The Longhorn Saloon had the most space for nightly gatherings, music, and dancing. One night in the saloon, Bobby and Clem got into a fist fight that became stunning entertainment. It was in slow motion, their punches barely connecting, but sending their jaws askew and their bodies buckling with such graduated precision that it knocked any lingering thought from my mind. Bobby's fist finally sent Clem exploding to the floor, where he buoyantly rolled and bounced several times before coming to a stop and leaving the rest of us agape. The next time visitors came up from the valley, we let the weed go around and, on cue, slowed our movements to about a third normal speed. In a growling baritone, Bobby asked, "Would you pass me the guitar?" It seemed to float forever in his hand. When the visitors were looking at each other, questioning their own perceptions, we increased speed and ran the game to them. Bobby was a mover. I think he wanted to act, write, draw, paint, travel, play multiple instruments, compose and record his own music, and build whatever he imagined. Nearly everything was easy for him, and he attracted women without even noticing them. He spent as much time in the Valley, LA, the Hollywood Hills, Topanga Canyon, and other parts of California as he did at the ranch. At times, Bobby seemed indifferent to all but himself, and likewise, he could easily be ignored. But his self-interest was partly in keeping with his determination to be self-sufficient. Like most of us, he was barely out of his teens, still asserting his independence. I remember Bobby and Charlie walking together, enthusiastically trading info and banter. Bobby wearing a big smile, well-fitted jeans, and a knife in one boot. I never wanted to build conceit or give guys respect they hadn't earned it. But, in hindsight, on occasion, Bobby was visually grand. A swashbuckling prince out to explore rough places, dine in finery, laugh with gusto, give women a tumble, and walk away to conquer more of the world. Bobby was a peacock, and Charlie loved him. He knew what he wanted, and he went for it without guilt or hesitation. He'd unashamedly stand in front of a mirror, trying on a shirt after shirt. In front of a mirror, trying on shirt after shirt, checking himself from all angles. Of course, others of us might do the same in private, but wouldn't do it in front of others because it looked vain. Bobby was brimming with energy and talent and creativity. He had interesting clothes, antique vehicles, and friends all over California. He had ideas, places to go, and people to meet, and he was eager to involve Charlie in his creative projects. So there was a time when the hustle and bustle was about getting Charlie and Bobby dressed to go into Los Angeles on one of Bobby's trips. The parachute room behind the movie set was a cushy, secluded place for afternoon naps and intimate mergers. It began as an abandoned trailer that, years before, had been backed to the edge of a cliff, its rear end entangled in the bramble of a tree that grew from the creek bank below. Brenda or Ruth conceived of covering the inside with billowing white parachutes so that it was like being in a cloud. Through the open back windows no earth could be seen, only sky, trees, roosters, and others of wings. The parachutes came from military surplus. Brenda and Charlie were thinking to design lightweight capes that could be turned into personal tents. Drawstrings could shorten or lengthen the capes and create a hood with little, if any, added stitching. Brenda would perfect the design and experiment with dyes and desert colors. Like other animals, our survival might one day depend upon our ability to blend into our surroundings. We would also need shoes and clothes as near impervious to the harsh conditions as we could get. Once in the desert at Barker's, as many of us sat around a table in the kitchen by candlelight, Charlie showed us how to make patterns for clothes. He wanted clothes made for himself, and, as usual, the girls were eager to learn. I thought and still think it was very cool that he was showing us this, but I was acutely aware of my separation from the group. As he cut out the paper patterns, I lost track and understanding of what he was doing, and I felt stupid and afraid that he could see my separation and the shame and guilt I felt for having fear and pain in my body, for, in short, being a wounded and scarred human being. I forgot what precipitated this. It may have been because he did see my pain, but he brought me in front of everyone, and he started inspecting me. He looked at my teeth as if I were a horse. He was saying, as he turned me around, "Not bad." He pulled up my shirt and, pointing out the long curved scar that runs from my right mid-back to under my right arm, he said, "Been in the shop a few times, but we can use it." Rather than feel embarrassed or humiliated, I felt seen and acknowledged. I always appreciated Charlie's attention, but there were so many of us, and I think everyone wanted to be with him, and wanted any excuse to do something for him. One time at Barker's, the girls were baking cookies and fruit turnovers on the wood stove. I ran outside with a cookie sheet of half-burnt ones to offer Charlie. He took a bite and said, "I can taste the competition." I was turning the front room of the bunkhouse into a Victorian parlor when Danny DiCarlo and his chopper moved in. I'd put up a frame for a print of a 19th century nude and ran to get the picture, but on return I found etched within the frame the head of a demon and the words, "Straight Satan's 1%. Danny was a dark-haired outlaw biker who almost always wore black engineer boots and his club colors, A denim jacket with the sleeves cut off, and a patch across the back showing the club's name and caricatured devil. They were some of the proud one-percenters. In the 1940s, public relation reps of the American Motorcycle Association had stated that 99% of all motorcyclists were law-abiding citizens. Danny claimed the bunkhouse for his bike, his gun collection, its display rack, and a bullet-making outfit. Most days he worked on his bike, playing Jazz Station 105 loud, and he got mad if anyone messed with the station. Some of the girls did, so he welded it on there. Straight Satans came to the ranch for afternoons, as did members of another club, Satan's Slaves, but only Danny moved in. Each of the bikers was different. Joe was unmarried, with a light prison record and a steady job. L.A. George had a beautiful young wife with a bunch of blonde little kids. Droopy was a Satan slave. I think his dad was a biker. He had an old knucklehead that Charlie wanted to buy. Droopy was one of those gentle giants. What a casual guy. I never even heard him talk, but one time I saw him and Charlie and some of the other people kicked back in the saloon, talking all night, for so long that the candles on the wooden coffee table melted down and set it on fire. They didn't even break conversation. They just carried the table outside and stood warming their hands over it as the sun was coming up and the mist was rising off the hills. There were other bikers, but these were the guys that I remember. The sky turned gray. The wind kicked up tarps and sent stray hay flying. I saw Ruth and Danny in long coats like gangsters, trekking the hills, carrying something. And later in the house, George and I were trying to figure out where all the shooting was coming from, ricocheting in the hollow. Could we thunder and lightning? He said no. So I got up just to find out who was in our woods. Check to see if there's riders, he told me, and see what the boys are up to. And already out the door, I ran back. And what? Don't forget to shut the storm door. Checking on Larry was always a trip. He was usually grousing or telling yarns to customers, like about his being a Blackfoot Indian and having to kill the whole cavalry with his bare hands and only one knife. Checking on the others was a cursory exercise because George didn't want to hear that Randy was in his trailer or that Juan was straddling horses when there were no paying customers. And surely not that an outlaw biker and little Weesh were in the hills firing a machine gun. There were other things to speak of, and by the time I made it back to the house, the subject had changed. According to police reports, Danny had a modest arsenal, including rifles, shotguns, carbines, and a submachine gun. He was quoted later as saying that when he first brought guns to the ranch, Charlie had asked, "What are we going to do with the machine gun?" And when Danny told him it was for protection, Charlie laughed and said, "We don't need nothing like that." But after a couple of months of his personal influence, Danny said everyone had fun shooting his guns. His bullet-making setup was interesting. I watched him pour molten metal into the molds. He said that it took him about an hour to make several hundred rounds, and in a matter of minutes it was gone. Cowboy Benny was staying with his girlfriend and only part-time at the ranch. But Pearl had hired John Swartz, the ex-ranch hand that Bobby and Charlie had caught stealing hay. At Pearl's suggestion, Johnny, she called him, was moving into the trailer beside George's house. I thought John Swartz was over 40. He still had the muscular arms of a farm boy, but his white blonde hair was thin on top, his face perpetually crimson, and he looked like he never got enough sleep. He must have known that we hadn't told Pearl and George about his thefts, but whether that made him more amenable to us, I don't know. I never saw him show feelings about anything, one way or the other. Cappy said that rattlesnakes have 2 penises on each side of their bodies. Each end? I asked. She laughed. Not each end, each side. But they could only use one at a time. Cappy knew interesting tidbits. She knew that horned toads are actually lizards. When confronted with danger, she said, they speed dig backwards until they're covered with sand. And if a predator threatens them, they can squirt blood from their eyes. And far, about 6 feet. As kids, we called them horny toads, and they were all over Southern California. But I never knew how remarkable they are, and now they are rare. Cappy didn't presume to teach. Her enthusiasm just bubbled over. When George said he was blind as a bat, she tactfully told him that she'd heard that bats aren't really blind, and about their fine-tuned sonar detection, and she really liked bats because they ate a ton of mosquitoes and other insects. And George thoughtfully nodded and told her he thought she was right. Cappy showed lots of personality, but also feelings of inadequacy. She had creamy skin and fine white gold hair, a full mouth, and big china blue eyes. She didn't like her legs, so she never wore dresses or skirts, and she tended to gain weight. Cappy loved most everyone at the ranch, and saw each person's gifts and beauty, and often seemed humbled by what she saw. Overall, she was exceptionally beautiful and didn't know it. She loved to talk and laugh and tell stories with the other girls, especially Mary and Ella. Mary was as fair and blue-eyed as Cappy, but Mary was tall and lean, and carried herself with surety and a sense of direction. I admired Mary's stamina, kindness, her competence, and her restraint in dealing with her jealousy of Lynn, and the constant influx of new women that Lynn encouraged by her friendliness and warmth. I felt empathetic towards Mary, a strong, capable woman, expected by Charlie, it seemed, not to need reassurance or attention, because she had a child and was strong. Mary met a baker at one of the markets and made an immediate connection. She had done some baking, but after meeting him, she just drove to another town on certain days of the week and picked up a giant plastic-lined paper bag containing many loaves of bread and a variety of pastries. I went with her once and busied myself finding food. She took her time. This baker was tall and awesomely handsome. They stood at the back of the market talking and laughing like a social event. Finally, I went to help her with the bag and heard part of the conversation. It was all about kids. He was a new father, and they spent their time together trading anecdotes. I remember Snake wandering alone down the ranch house road, tootling a little flute in the rain. Cherubic, with her auburn hair and pale teal eyes, she'd returned to the farmhouse at the end of the day, her face smudged with dirt and a few wilting plants in one hand. Snake wandered physically and mentally. She didn't appear to be sad or lonely, and she wasn't stupid. She could recite almost anything she had ever learned. Not that she was talkative, but she seemed pleased with her brain and to enjoy its company. If she communicated with other people, it was only by accident. Into any conversation, or the absence thereof, she inserted things like, I wonder if for every Bobcat car they sell, that makes one less Bobcat on Earth. It was an interesting wonder. Nobody looked askance. That was Snake. I didn't take the time to know Snake or consider her age and aspirations at the time her family had pulled up roots to become hippies. But Sandy and I overheard Charlie asking her if she wanted to go back to school. He surmised that she had been an A student, and she confirmed it. But she didn't express a desire to go anywhere. Sandy. Snake was in a category by herself. The youngest of us and most eccentric. She didn't drink coffee or chat like Katie, Ella, and Mary did. Her eyes were often at half-mast, whether due to the weed she liked so much, or to what looked like me near constant sexual arousal. It was by seeing her lip-licking attempts to draw Charlie that I learned that raw sex was not what attracted him. Snake had been weaned too young from a straight world to a hippie world, and then to the ranch. She had her 16-year-old libido and few social skills to navigate amongst more worldly people. The dynamics between Charlie and each person were as numerous as the people and changed hour by hour. Often he was a blur to me because he was always moving, going somewhere with someone, or lying down with a girl. I could torture myself wondering who he was with, and I saw others, particularly Bo and Snake, hovering and inquiring, "Where's Charlie? Who is he with?" Bo had a petite and nicely shaped body, but I never thought of her as pretty. Her nose curved downward, and she slunk around with her shoulders slouched and her fine curly hair obscuring much of her face. Under her dark cloud of hair, you could see her big brown eyes darting. She was an enigma and seldom spoke. Sometimes she'd utter an unintelligible word under her breath, along with a smile and a little laugh. Bo was 9 times more aware than me, so I missed a lot of what she did. But once as she sat before Charlie, I saw him massaging her head and shoulders, smoothing out her hair, bringing it back from her forehead and face. He gently pressed her forehead backward, straightening her neck, and Bo transformed before my eyes. When she stood up, her shoulders were straight, her head gracefully poised on top of her neck. She looked to me magnificent. Ruth was then about 17. In my mental trove of snapshots is one of her standing on the hard-packed dirt in the front yard, somebody's baby on one hip, and a plumber's wrench, thicker than her arm in the other hand. When the saloon roof leaked and nobody moved to fix it, Ruth borrowed a long extension ladder and patched it herself, looking to no one for direction or acknowledgement. Smooth, dark-browed, and beautiful, she might brood over matters of consequence, but genuinely went for and got what she wanted. In town, she asked a stranger for his car. He said she couldn't have the one he was driving, but he had an older car at home that he never used. She told him to bring it back to the parking lot, and she came home in a well-preserved 1949 Studebaker with the original beige flannel interior and a signed pink slip. Sandy. It was impossible to keep George Spahn's house clean, with the constant traffic of ranch hands stomping in from barn and corral to report the day-to-day business. The whole house slanted because the ground had moved and settled. The counter where food got fixed was slanted, so cats easily slid when you brushed them off, but no sooner would it be wiped clean, and the stove and cast iron pans scrubbed of bacon or hamburger grease. Then another ranch hand would come in to cook, leaving another mess. Ruth went after the kitchen cupboards with gusto, She removed every greasy glass jelly jar, restaurant coffee mug, and chipped teacup, and washed them in a big pot of sudsy boiled water. She tore out old shelf liners, put in new, and then proudly put back her sparkling assortment of glasses, pottery, and china, while selecting a favorite coffee cup and drinking glass for herself. Ruth was particular, and took good care of herself, and was selfish without guilt. Selfish in a healthy, out-front way that said, "This is what I want, this is what I will take, and I'll have it with gusto and pleasure." This was with food, her coffee, her shower, her clothes, where she slept, and who she slept with. She wasn't greedy and didn't step on anyone's toes, but her unabashed going for herself made her seem spoiled to me. Lynn and Charlie loved her. One time, Ruth and Lynn fell into what they called the laughing pit, with me standing on the outside of their joy, their loose bodies rolling around on a mattress as they laughed and laughed with abandon. Lack of youthful exuberance and a relaxed body kept me from the magic inner circle of Ruth, Lynn, and the young loves Lynn welcomed in and in and in. It ate at me, and Charlie would tell me the secret to happiness was in the giving. But I didn't understand that. I'd felt sore and uncomfortable my whole life, and I was unable to relax with anyone. Growing up, I had not seen much giving. My mother was not the gentle, submissive, dutiful wife that was the model for so many women of my generation, and I couldn't and wouldn't pretend to be docile and pliable. At 24, I had been abused too much to be a doormat for any living creature. That Lynn showed no jealousy was supposed to be an indication of her love and lack of ego. But I thought and still think that jealousy is natural. In day-to-day dealings, Lynn often seemed doubtful. But one thing was sure: her total love and devotion to Charlie. His obvious favoring of her put her in a position of being a kind of example for all the girls. I think this created conflict within us. I wanted a sure, safe mother, and there was nothing approaching a strong matriarch to Charlie's patriarch. I was envious of her position and her sheer luck in meeting him nearly a year before I did, and having only a few other women around instead of over 10. I could sense, though, that if a person is full, happy, and brimming with love, then giving would naturally follow. Brenda's movements in whatever she did were quick and sure. If she decided to make a shirt for one of the guys, she'd find fabric, cut it, and sometime within a few hours she'd have a whole new shirt, and later embroider it. She looked out for all the guys and was sensitive to their feelings, and wanted a little of the attention that Charlie was getting. And she treated them all with equal care and consideration. She was also aware of and giving to the girls. We all admired Brenda, and without jealousy as far as I knew. She was blunt in her speech, simple and straightforward, which could be off-putting. Complicated thoughts and feelings fraught with doubt and confusion might be met with a clear-eyed look, a shrug, and a word like, "So?" Or she might just say, "It's all perfect." Brenda was simply a magic witch, too busy doing for others to take time for introspection. She loved taking care of babies and wanted to have children herself. Lynn could absorb and respond to expressions of complex emotions, lending a sympathetic ear when she had time. But she didn't have time, or make much time. She had a big pile of sewing in George's house, projects that I don't recall her ever completing. Mostly she worked on Charlie's vest. When we were out of money, Bikers offered us stolen credit cards, but we didn't want them. Paul suggested that we could sell something. Well, we don't sell anything, Charlie maintained seriously. His eyebrows rose and he popped a grin. But we could trade it for money. It was a joke. We really didn't have a thing worth selling. Bill knew a club where girls who were so inclined might dance topless, but I don't know if anybody did. Despite what was later said to the contrary, we were a democracy, jokingly called an or we could just. We could, or we could, or we could just. It was a consensus-style government, everyone adding to the pool of thought. Charlie was both credited and blamed for having the most input, but anyone with ideas was welcome to toss them into the circle. When it came to getting money, Charlie went for what he knew. Her name was Charlene, a boot and whip style girl with a curvy body. I read later that she was some kind of heiress, but never mentioned it. He had met her at a party in Beverly Hills and invited her to the ranch. She didn't come. She had invited him to her ranch in Nevada, and instead of going alone, he asked Sandy, Brenda, Paul, and me to go with him. Charlene's Nevada ranch had an old-time hotel with a cowboy cafe at the front. Tired and hungry from the overnight drive, we went in for breakfast. Charlie sent one of the workers to let Charlene know that we had arrived. I almost missed seeing her. She was coming toward Charlie, but after seeing the rest of us, she wheeled on her high-heeled boots and let the screen door slam behind her. He went out to talk to her, and pretty soon an employee showed the rest of us to a bare rustic room with 2 beds, no telephone, and no TV. I don't know what gave me the impression that this ranch was more about women than horses, but I knew about Nevada's Mustang Ranch, and I was beginning to think that Charlene might be running such an establishment. In any case, it was not an entertaining trip for us. We slept most of the time, and the next day Charlie returned to say we were leaving. As we drove away, he said that he offered Charlene a place with us, but she didn't want it. I found out later that she had offered him a Cadillac, but he refused it. Apparently, this wasn't about stuff or money. Charlie didn't talk about money. It wasn't a secret, but a non-issue. He said we never had to go out of our way to get money before, and shouldn't have to now. With Bill and the bikers, he pipe-dreamed fantasy schemes that ended in zuzus. One time he was walking away from a guy, shaking his head and saying, if you offered some people a nickel to hit themselves on the head, they'd beat themselves to death. For a little while, a little trailer was parked down by the bunkhouse. Entering it one afternoon, I saw glossy hair cross a pillow and bare legs in the air. It was one of the Hollywood hopefuls, with a beautiful body and straight teeth, murmuring and arching her back. Charlie leaned back on his haunches and yelled, "Cut!" He flashed me a grin and a wink. Then he rolled over and called action. She never even opened her eyes, but if she could have seen herself in an old trailer beside a fake saloon where Buster Crabbe and Gabby Hayes tipped color-watered whiskeys, she might have thought it funny herself. Sandy walked in on a similar scene and didn't think it was funny at all. I left the ranch in a peak of jealousy. Holidays for me had traditionally been tumultuous, and this one was no different. I had gone into the trailer looking for something and discovered Charlie about to make love to some aspiring Hollywood starlet. It was my 25th birthday, and he hadn't so much as said hello to me. I opened and slammed every cupboard, and before he could get on his jeans, I slammed the trailer door behind me and was down the road. I hitchhiked to Topanga Canyon, the only place I knew in L.A., to the apartment of Bobby Beausoleil's former landlord, Gary Hinman. Gary greeted me at the door smiling, but I noticed that his eyes were cold. I asked if I could stay a few days, and he seemed to reflect both curiosity and calculations. Why had I left the ranch? And what would I give him if he allowed me to stay? He offered me the extra bed in his bedroom. I made it clear that I had nothing to give in return. I didn't have any money, and sex was out of the question. I think I even told him I was pregnant by Bobby. I didn't know then that Gary was homosexual, and he had a crush on Bobby. When I sat down in his living room, Gary's cat, Suck, came to sit on my lap and knead my skin with his paws. It was interesting at first, but then it got weird and disturbing. There was something similar about Gary and his cat. The next 2 days were awkward. Most of the time we spent apart. I roved around an LA suburb while he gave a boy piano lessons. He went out at night to sell LSD and chemicals I was not familiar with. I decided to go back to my old friends in San Francisco. Tex returned after a 3-month absence. He had reported to the draft board in December after receiving an official order, but a knee injury he'd received in a car accident before he met us won him a medical deferment. He said he'd gotten the attending doctor to hype his continuing disability. Afterward, he spent the winter in a comfortable Hollywood apartment, dealing weed and speed with his old girlfriend. He said they were a good team and made a lot of money, but the life seemed false and no longer satisfied him. Tex observed that we, like the Hollywood people, were collecting supplies and money. But I think that the nightclub had more to do with entertainment than profit. One of the horseback riders, as she dismounted, said that she had to get cleaned up because she was going to a nightclub, which spurred one of us to joke that we had our own nightclub in the saloon, causing someone else to imagine the saloon actually transformed into a place where people could come to hear live music and dance. I think that's how the thing got rolling. The saloon had a stage with electric hookups for instruments, a big hardwood dance floor, and even a bar. When Charlie's friend Bill heard of it, he calculated a round dollar amount that might be profited. Bill was always good for a money deal, and he took the proposal to George, offering him a part of any money we took in at the door, and suggesting that, as a bonus, nightclub riders might well come back to ride horses. George reined in his immediate interest by stating his uncertainty about the legalities of running such an establishment, but when Bill assured him that he'd do the legal checking, George said yes, even agreeing to let us enlarge the saloon by taking down a jailhouse wall. A cowboy saloon would have been cool for a club, but back in the day, it was all about fluorescence and outer space. Our house band, consisting mostly of Bobby, Charlie, and Steve, already called themselves the Milky Way. So, in keeping with the theme, the saloon became infinitely dark, with tiny phosphorescent planets and stars speckled throughout. Brenda was the decorating visionary, overseeing, or in this case underseeing, a ceiling covered in billowing parachutes, dyed in part to resemble clouds, and in part the night sky. The stage walls were blacked, overlapped with day-glow freeform, and lit by black lights, and the dance floor had several moods of lighting, including the flashing strobes that appeared to fragment moving bodies. The whole effect, if not whiskey a go-go, was nightclub enough. One end of the room we reserved as a comfortable hangout, with couches, lamps, candles, and a coffee table. When our San Francisco artist John had his family stopped by, he painted a spectacular mural above the couches showing a city in flames as people on motorcycles fled to a clean land in the desert. The Milky Way jammed electrically almost every night. When they wanted a break, we played 45 records that we'd paid to have professionally stocked and George's antique Wurlitzer jukebox. More people came to the nightclub than we expected, and predictably, we didn't charge them to enter. Some moments the place was a tornado of fragmented, whirling bodies, and at others it settled into a serene den with kicked-back conversation, the flicker of candles dancing across the mural in the living room. We put out popcorn, sold sodas, and stuck a sign for donations on a big water cooler bottle, getting up to $20 a night, which was just enough to give George a sense of success and buy more sodas. Some of the bikers brought beer, and we girls were not above secretly pouring it out to keep them sober. One night, a big guy mishandled one of the girls on the dance floor, and seeing it from the stage, Charlie called the guy out in a pitch he once referred to as a tone 40. He had explained to Mary and me that the tone 40 was used by commanding officers in the military. It froze the room. The music stopped, and he was the only one moving until he jumped from the stage and the dance crowd parted. When the two men faced each other, their size disparity was alarming. It would have been a mismatched fight, but was quickly resolved when the big guy swung. Charlie ducked under his arm and behind him, reached behind his legs, took a grip, and escorted that guy out the door by the collar of his shirt and his balls. Events like that continued to reinforce our belief that Charlie would take care of everything. Another night in the club, someone came after Danny. Danny possibly loved one thing more than his bike. A 10-month-old boy, he said, would grow up to be a real motherfucker. He brought his son to live at the back of the ranch with Sunstone and the other toddlers. Then late one night, a dark, wiry woman burst into the nightclub, fully loaded and screaming that Danny had kidnapped her kid. From the time she hit the door, she never stopped moving, jumping on tables and throwing anything she could grab. Danny shouted, "I swear to God I'll kill you if you don't get down." And they tangled, she digging into his face and drawing blood with her nails, he pulling her long black hair until she was a crazy mess on the floor, kicking, punching, scratching, shrieking. Charlie helped Danny drag her out the door, and the people who brought her took her away. About an hour later, the police came to charge both Danny and Charlie with assault. The woman was Danny's wife. I didn't know Danny had a wife. She had cleaned up her words and actions for the police report, but it was clear that she was under the influence of something. Danny told police he wasn't about to leave his kid with a woman he considered less responsible than himself. a statement honestly considered funny by everybody who heard it. I don't know how or if this was resolved, but Danny and Charlie did not go to jail, and his son remained with us. Of course, whenever attention was brought to the kids, they could go stay at the Fountain of the World. One time, Charlie was driving a car full of girls and babies down the narrow, winding pass road from the fountain back to the ranch when the brakes cut out. Their speed increased, and he yelled to the girls, "Are you all ready?" No choice. Faster and faster they sped, swoosh around one curve, screech around the next, to the edge of the cliff, and then straight for the rocks. He was zigzagging the car to slow it, brushing against the mountain, scraping, nearly rolling, at least a mile like this, and then down the north drive at the ranch to the haystack. No one was hurt, but Ruth came running into George's house to tell us about it, and I fell into the holes of her eyes. The police began showing up at the nightclub, yelling for us to stop the music and stay where we were so they could check IDs. Because we were not a paying establishment, they took liberties without search warrants, at least once arresting someone who didn't take kindly to the harassment. After that, the nightclub itself was pretty much a bust. George didn't say much about it. He was resigned to the ups and downs of ne'er-do-wells. I didn't know that he considered himself a failure. Sandy came back from San Francisco. She said that her old friends seemed stuck in the same routines, and that no one even approached what she saw in Charlie. I came back to the ranch because I hadn't seen anything better thus far in my life. Charlie obviously loved making love to pretty women. Although anything of beauty caught his eye, all of nature was beautiful to him. And I learned that women who were most comfortable being close to nature, who didn't wear makeup or tried to look like magazine covers, appealed to him way more than what he once called plastic fantastics. Despite my constant frustration with the arrival of new girls, these were attractive, interesting, talented, and friendly people on a horse ranch. A group of resourceful women without jobs or income, living close to the ground, away from streets and cars and noise, able to make beautiful clothes and find and prepare healthy, tasty meals from dumpsters, and to be happy doing it all was astonishing to me. Sitting around the ranch front drinking coffee, watching the parade of wranglers and riders, George Spahn taking his daily walk, Randy Starr yelling, chickens clucking, roosters crowing, the old goat, the dogs, the horses coming and going with new riders on their backs, even opportunities to ride a horse, might not have been enough to keep me at the ranch. But I held to the hope that I could spend more time with Charlie. Charlie was all over Hollywood, meeting and playing music with talented and famous people. Greg Jacobson was one of them. Greg looked to me like the tall, handsome prince in fairy tales. A longtime friend of both Dennis and producer Terry Melcher, he was employed by Terry to scout talent and movie projects. When we met him, Greg was living with one of the daughters of an American comedy icon, and they had a child together. But there was talk of separation. Before he even visited the ranch, Greg and Charlie began philosophical discussions that lasted, on and off, for months. Greg was more aware and far more curious than most of his colleagues. He was also more mystical. Another part of him figured finances and finagled business deals. He recommended that Terry come to hear us sing and consider us subjects for a movie project. Later, he described what he saw at the ranch for a jury. I remember the picture. I have a picture in my head of it all. It was very clear what my eyes took in as I stood there on the field out in the back of the ranch with the motorcycles and the girls and the guys and the horses and the trucks and the brown grass and the green trees and the blue sky and the stream. Would have made a very nice picture for other people to see as well as myself. The picture is still in my head. I could see it now when I just described it to you. Greg Jacobson testimony, page 14,307, court transcripts, 1970, Tate LaBianca trial. Hearing about Greg, Doris Day's son Terry, and the prospective music and movie project put George in a good mood. I was in the kitchen fixing jars of cold lemonade, and he was telling me about Corriganville, his competitor Crash Corrigan's big tourist and movie ranch just north of us. And he was envisioning a ranch like that. Us girls in cowgirl skirts, little white boots, and little white gloves, collecting money from the dozens of customers in the sunny yard, the serene sounds of baby ducks, chicks, and lambs, a little schoolhouse with a bell, he said, and a hillbilly house with polka dot long johns hanging off the line. I told him I'd be right back, took a jar of lemonade outside, and from the steps of the veranda saw 4 motorcycles being worked on by the greasiest bearded ruffians George's mind could conjure, and thin golden girls sitting in the dust with hardly a thing on, let alone little white gloves. Most of the bikes that showed up at the ranch were choppers, minimalist custom amalgamations of American and British bikes, and the guys they belonged to regularly honed and tuned them. Of the girls, Ruth and Leslie were probably most interested in motorcycle mechanics. They knew if Danny had a knucklehead, a shovelhead, or a panhead motor, and that he was so particular about his bike he wouldn't let anyone else touch it. After some weeks as onlookers, though, they were given the honor of polishing parts. Once or twice they went with Danny and some of his club guys on putts, bike runs that took them a few days and many miles from the ranch. They loved it. Bobby had asked Leslie to help him put a motorcycle together, and she was a quick study, but by the time she could have been a real asset to the build, he had decided to buy a boat and sail around the world. Randy Starr sarcastically summoned me. He knew I didn't want to watch the castration of a young stallion, but I heard the struggles, and later heard Randy bray about eating fried mountain oysters. Charlie told me to keep an eye on Cowboy Larry around little kids. I didn't know what he was talking about, but sometime later, kids were running around the front of the ranch while we relaxed with their parents, and I saw Larry teasing a barefoot little girl in a dress. She ran off giggling, and that's when I caught the shine in his eyes, the mischief in his grin. I never would have thought to notice, but just before Larry gave chase, I was able to casually head off a potential disaster. Larry wasn't a child molester. He was a child with grown-up parts. Want to hear a story? George was a grown-up with child parts. I sat down beside him. Once upon a time, he said, there was a big, humongous bar full of wheat. Well, there were these little mice around the barn, so one little mouse went into the barn and got a grain of wheat, and he came out. Then another little mouse went in and got a grain of wheat, and he came out. Then another little mouse went in. About the third mouse, I protested. Is that all? George suppressed a snicker. Another little mouse went in and got a grain of wheat. Is that all that happens until they empty the barn? He thought our complaints were hilarious. He said his kids used to say the same things. George and his wife had 9 grown children, some of whom lived in different states. His daughter, Tootie, came one time in a shiny late-model truck. She was a big-boned woman wearing pressed Western clothes and nice boots. His son, Jim, was a handsome man about 40. He was the first to visit while we were there, and the only one to visit more than once. Jim was also dressed in the boot and buckle style of ranchers, which he was. He had a ranch of his own. In fact, George told me, all but one of his kids were prosperous. Almost everyone was busy, but Paul was shuffling around after Charlie, saying he didn't really know what to do. And all of a sudden, Charlie sounded annoyed. He said seriously, "Why don't you go back to your mommy and daddy?" Paul didn't like that. Later, I heard Charlie had asked him to take supplies to the desert for Brooks and Juanita, and he did. Toughening a mass of people for hard times was a responsibility Charlie said he didn't want. But I believe that, whether consciously or unconsciously, he accounted for everyone and everything on the ranch. Late one night, after gathering in the saloon, 5 or 6 of us girls huddled near George's house, shivering and talking. Charlie passed us, snarling. "Can't you hear them?" I heard nothing but the other girls. He said, "Mutsy's chasing the baby chicks." And he took off running down the dark, tangled ravine behind the house. None of us followed. Pretty soon, Mutsy, his eyes cast backward in terror, came streaking past us into George's house, with Charlie close behind, and the night chill turned to fear. In the dim light through the open door, we could see Mutsy cowering under Charlie's knife. Afterward, he told me to clean up the floor. There was piss all over the linoleum. Mutsy was a sweet-tempered dog. I didn't know he'd been eating the chicks. Charlie looked like a bully. But in the aftermath, Mutsy didn't chase chickens again, and seemed no worse for the terrifying experience. George had a new dog he named Fritz. A lapdog so small it more often slept on his shoulder. One day, after 2 sheriff's deputies visited and left the house, he had mentioned to them that Fritz was tuckered out and had to take a nap. Pretty soon, they'd wanted to know all about this new fella Fritz, if he was a ranch hand, or with Charlie and his bunch. George thought this was funny. He'd had to identify Fritz. He said they'd been sitting across from him for 15 minutes, close enough to reach out and touch him. And they admitted that they hadn't seen that he had a dog on his shoulder. Police were a constant in our lives. One time, a young deputy was relaxing in one of the chairs on the boardwalk with some of the guys, and they were all laughing. I heard the cop say, "It looks like you guys have it made. And I wouldn't mind living like this." Someone said he could, and he asked how. Charlie said, You take off that badge and stick it in the hat. Put the hat on the front seat of the car and walk away with faith in yourself." "Sounds nice," the cop said, "but my wife would never go for it." It was a stale punchline, but the guys obliged a chuckle. Unestablished groups naturally raised curiosity, but in police that translated as suspicion that fostered adversity. When we talked to them, they came more often. When we ignored them, they got mad. Pretty soon, they acted like they wanted us to do wrong, so they could bust in and find out what's going on here, and how the hell can you do it when I can't. I stepped out of George's house just as sheriffs were cruising the yard. One of them was pointing his trigger finger at Brenda. Winking and grinning, he said to her, "Gotcha." She said, "I'm not playing that game," and went about her work. Another day, I heard one of them call to Charlie, "We're gonna get you yet, Manson." I didn't know if the man thought he was joking or if he wanted us to think it, but I took it as a straight-up threat. The next time we heard from Paul, we learned that Juanita would not be returning to the ranch, and possibly the least populated wilderness of California. She had found her man. They're getting married, Paul said of her and the miner she met at Barker's. We wouldn't see Juanita again, but last I heard, she and her husband were still together after decades. Terry Melcher was blonde and had the wide, freckled face of his actress mother, Doris Day. In the early 1960s, she was the movie image of wholesome American womanhood, notably cast in several movies with Rock Hudson, the popular ladies' man, and one of the best-kept secrets in Hollywood. Terry had a long collaborative association with the Beach Boys and other pop musicians. He'd produced an album for the Byrds and was working on music for the upcoming motorcycle movie, Easy Rider. At 27, Terry was a busy man, but on Greg Jacobson's recommendation, he'd agreed to come see us and hear the music. Many of the girls prepared a place for his visit, but he didn't show. He could have called, but he didn't do it either. I heard that this happened twice. It seemed strange that both Dennis and Terry, while so polished in appearance, would display sloppy business habits. I don't remember us talking about this or Charlie saying anything about it, but I always liked something he once said to us. When anyone lies to me, they tell me they lie, and that's the truth. Everything has been here for you. It's all been at your hand. Don't try to build a new world. Just learn to live off the land. C. Manson, Song, 1969. Brenda read aloud to herself the list of ingredients in a small bag of corn chips, including the then commonly added chemical preservatives BHA and BHT. In typical understatement with just a touch of amazement, she said, "Wow, they really embalm you before you die." Each of us had food penchants, and nothing was verboten. But every night we ate vegetable dishes with sauces with rice or pasta. A garden would have been great for us, orchards and milk animals and chicken eggs. We took trips for exploration to decrease our numbers and to get out from under the ebbs and flows of negativity from people such as Pearl, Randy, and the police. I wouldn't have been comfortable leaving had someone not stayed with George. and one or more of us always did. Camped under a giant oak on the land George referred to as Iverson's, Karate Dave was bitten by a rattlesnake. For hours, he stood with his back against the tree, his glassy eyes reflecting the night fire. In the interest of keeping him calm, nobody said much to him about the bite, and within a day or two, he didn't limp at all. Rattlesnakes were all around the ranch, although I never saw one. But in a desert town, some of us saw a coiled sidewinder under a truck. The truck owner had brought out a rifle to kill it, but Cappy and I asked him not to. We thought there must be a way to move it. The man had a wife and a small child. Gruffly, he told us, "You got 5 minutes." After about 3, Sandy got mad. "Oh, for God's sake," she said. "Either move it or move out of the way." The man shot once, hitting the snake near the head. Sandy walked over and picked it up. Then it moved. If the man hadn't rushed to knock it from her hand, it would have bitten her. It wasn't alive, but it was neurologically triggered to strike. I was potentially afraid of any creature with which I was unfamiliar. At the same time, I think all of us believed that every species has an earthly purpose, and none is divinely assigned to chase around frightened people. Charlie was passionate about wildlife. Dennis and Greg had gone out to the desert to see him and were astounded at his wrath when one of them drove over a spider. More than a year before, in a park, some teenage boys were chasing down a spider to kill it because some girls were afraid of it, and Charlie got to it before they did. "It's natural to be aware of what bites you," he told them, "but I don't think spiders eat people." The boys looked embarrassed. He said, "I would get something away from me if I wasn't sure, but I wouldn't destroy it because I wasn't sure. If you keep doing that, you're going to have no life left." Living outdoors gave us a sense of the essential, and living covertly, closely together, was teaching us to function as parts of one body. About 8 of us girls were camped near the ranch when a large enough vehicle became available to take us on a reconnaissance run to the desert. We arose in the dark, quickly uprooted the tent, and, with strenuous effort, carried it and many supplies in a long, 2-way shuttle through dark, scratchy brambles, over a giant boulder, along a skimpy ledge, past a bush full of bees, over a deep gully, under arched branches, and up a sharp cliff to the pass road. I remember details because we made so many trips to and from the campsite. At dawn, Karate Dave arrived in an old bread truck supplied by Danny. We were all girls, dressed bulgy warm, on our way to a land of new promise and no police. If they had just let us go. But that didn't happen. On Highway 395, near the desert town of Lancaster, we were stopped by the Los Angeles County Sheriffs, still within their vast jurisdiction. Before deboarding, one of us suggested we pretend to be small groups of hitchhikers, rather than what police might consider a hippie commune. This seemed like a good idea, until I realized we looked undeniably similar. Then there was Dave transporting all these women to where, and for what purpose. The whole thing was just too suspicious for them. especially when none of us could produce an owner's registration for the bread truck. It was impounded, and we were all booked. This was my third arrest for Grand Theft Auto, and I hadn't stolen as much as a Tonka toy. Before we got to the sheriff's substation, Sandy, being pregnant, was allowed to use a gas station restroom, and this was the first of several times she was forgotten during an arrest. Soon she was at the sheriff's door asking to be taken in with the rest of us. About a day later, charges were dismissed, and most of us were released. We had to leave Danny's bread truck for lack of funds to retrieve it, and I think this was the time that Ruth was kept in custody as a juvenile. Her release contingent upon her legal marriage license and her father's written permission for her to marry. George Spahn was solemn as I explained the hitch to him, after which he resolutely said, "Let's go and get our wish," which we did. She was released into his guardianship. George was the understanding grandfather and a stern patriarch of the ranch. Charlie was the new age, the visionary, the sage, and the wild one.